In 1963, the year I was born, there was a Russian scientist named Igor Tchaikovsky. Dr. Tchaikovsky was in the news a lot back then because he had this theory that we were all born innate swimmers. It wasn't that he had the theory that had him in the news, it was more so the methodology he was using to prove it. You see, he was the guy you probably first heard about that first started throwing infants into the swimming pool and watching as they writhed in disorientation and confusion and panic, and then surfaced and righted themselves on their backs and floated to survive. I never understood what my parents' interest was in having their kids be swimmers. Neither of them were athletes, and frankly, neither of them could even swim. But they were into being trendy. And living in Southern California at the time, it was trendy to have your kids be swimmers. So they hired a swimming instructor who was a follower of Dr. Tchaikovsky's methods. So at 6 months old, they threw me into the pool and watched as I writhed in disorientation and confusion and panic, and then surfaced, awash with life, and very happily floated on my back. That was the beginning of my life as a competitive swimmer. And to this day, I believe the foundation for my strength and ability to survive. Fast forward to 1976, the bicentennial year. At the ripe old age of 13, I was burnt out on swimming. I wanted to switch to springboard diving instead. We had moved to Colorado Springs full-time when I was 9, and I was growing up in the Broadmoor. My parents at the time had invested in some liquor stores around town, and my mom chose to work the night shift at one of the stores so as to not have to spend her evenings with my drunken father. Kit was 20 years old. He was a frequent customer at the liquor store. There was 3-2 beer back then. And he and my mom sort of struck up a relationship. They would chit-chat and share their thoughts and feelings about things in the news and the weather, and shared stories and told jokes and spent a fair amount of time just talking. Well, one evening my mom asked him, "How come your hair is always wet when you come in?" And Kit said, "Well, my day job is that I work at the zoo where I'm the elephant trainer. But I've got this nighttime gig at the deaf and blind school where I run the swimming program." "You're a swimmer?" He says, "Well, actually, I'm a diver." "My daughter wants to be a diver." Never underestimate the power of a Jewish mother's ability to matchmake for her daughter. She had fallen in love with him, and she knew I would too. So she hired him to teach me how to dive and to be my coach. My first lesson was that next Saturday morning. Kit showed up to pick me up at our house and rang the doorbell, and I ran to answer it with my swim bag in hand and opened the door and laid eyes on the dreamiest boy I'd ever seen. He had long, strawberry blonde hair and clear blue eyes, a big smile, and bell-bottom Levi's with a big peace symbol belt buckle and hiking boots. Didn't get any better than that in 1976. At the time, Kit was driving this 67 Chevy Camaro, convertible, red-ish. It kind of had more of that gray primer stuff on it than it had red car color, and the seats were black vinyl, and they had holes in them where the stuffing and the foam was all coming out, and frankly, I was a little freaked out by his car. But I didn't care. I would go anywhere with this boy. So we piled into that heap of a car and headed off to our first diving lesson, and both of us just grinning ear to ear, catching bugs in our teeth with that convertible as we were embracing this new experience. I had never been in a vehicle other than a Cadillac, and certainly never alone with a cute boy. Kit had never been to a country club. It was the Country Club of Colorado when it first opened, and we used to call it Gates, and it was nothing more than a 9-hole course and a restaurant, a couple tennis courts, and a pool in a bubble with 2 trailers parked next to it for the locker rooms, and this weird plastic tunnel you'd walk from the trailers to the pool. It's changed a little since then. That first lesson, I dove in, of my own volition, head first, and surfaced awash with love. There's a funny little side story to this, where my parents, in their bizarre sense of values, bought me a car when I was 13 years old, so that Kit could drive me in that car to the country club for our diving lessons. It was a Subaru when there was only one model of Subaru and no dealership. People were just hearing about cars being built and imported from Japan, of all places. And Kit, being Kit, never once thought that my parents were saying that his car wasn't good enough, or they didn't want their daughter being seen getting out of that car at the country club. He just thought it was really cool, and an opportunity to teach me how to drive a stick shift, which he did. So commenced these diving and driving lessons. We would go diving for a while, and then we'd go driving for a while, and most of all, we just talked. We talked and talked about everything and anything, hours upon end. And we became best friends. When I was 14 years old, Kit hired me to work with him at the Deaf and Blind School, and together we ran the swimming program there for a number of years. I used to get in that little Subaru and illegally drive myself up to the zoo to visit him at work as often as I could. If it meant that I had to skip school, oh well, that was all the better. I did that a lot. Then one day it happened. We had our first date. I drove up to the zoo, and Kit came out of the elephant barn, and he said, "I gotta go to the dump. You wanna come?" Yeah, I wanna go. Yeah, let's go to the dump. I didn't know what the dump was. I was living in the Broadmoor. There was a big truck that would come and take your trash, and what happened to the trash after that, I didn't have a clue. But I didn't care. I would go anywhere with this boy. So we piled into the zoo's dump truck and headed down 21st Street and turned left on Gold Camp Road and went to Upper Gold Camp Road, where Red Rock's open spaces now actually used to be the dump. Kit backed up to the trash heap and got out of the truck, said, "I'll be back in just a minute." And I sat and waited and watched in the side view mirror as he pulled this big lever on the side of the truck, and that activated the hydraulics that lifted the big bed, and then the tailgate made this boom crash when it dumped its load. And oh my God, my eyes were watering, my throat was burning, I was gasping for any breathable air. To this day, it was the foulest odor I have ever encountered. Kit got back in the truck, and I said, "What the hell is that smell?" He said, "Well, elephant dung." That whole thing was filled with zoo poo? He's like, "Well, yeah. Didn't you smell it the whole drive over here with the windows open?" I didn't notice. I was in heaven. I was on my first date with Kit. Somewhere he asked me to go with him that wasn't the pool, Deaf and Blind, or the zoo. I wasn't going to notice anything stinky. So not long after that first date, we were closing up the pool one night at Deaf and Blind, and I gave him a letter that I wrote to him. It was a very eloquent letter, professing my love for him, telling him I wanted him to be the one. and informed him of my intent to marry him. I accompanied the letter with a 45 record of Glenn Campbell singing Forever in Blue Jeans. And that was my, albeit cheesy, way of letting him know that I didn't care that he didn't have money. I just wanted to be with him forever. After reading the letter, Kit began to cry, and I began to cry, and we hugged and we cried, and he ever so gently explained to me that the timing was just off for us both. After all, he was 22. And even though I had left home and was living on my own at 15, I was still jailbait. So we would be destined to be best friends and work at Deaf and Blind together, go diving a few times a week, and talk almost every day. He was involved with a girl his age, and she got pregnant. And Kit, being Kit, always doing the right thing, thought that the right thing was to marry her, and he did. And they had a daughter. It was clearly not the right thing. The marriage was a disaster. It didn't last 2 years before all their belongings were in the back of a U-Haul, and he was driving them to Southern California, where she would raise their daughter in her own parents' home. And of course, that's a whole nother story. But in the meantime, I had come of age. And we both had known from the very beginning that we were soulmates. We both knew that nothing made more sense than the two of us to be together forever. So we took our friendship to the next level, eventually moved in together. And then on 7/11/1986, 10 years from the time that we met, 10 years from love at first sight, I married him, just like I said I would. If such a thing exists as a perfect marriage, and if there were a poster to advertise it, our picture would be on that poster. That seemingly perfect balance of friendship, passion, commitment, mutual growth, and above all, respect. Never once we ever raised our voices in anger at each other. And the marriage was only threatened one time, and that was 15 years ago, when I was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. It had never dawned on either one of us that forever might not happen. And then on New Year's 2012, 35 years from the time that we met, Kit died at the age of 56 of pancreatic cancer. This time, it was life itself that threw me into the depths and watched as I writhed in disorientation and confusion and panic, paralyzed and alone. I had not known a life without him the center of it since I was 13 years old. Eventually, I surfaced, awash in grief, and began to float to survive. But I knew I needed to do more than float. I knew I needed to swim. So 32 years after leaving competitive swimming, I found my way back to the pool. I began training at the Olympic Training Center 4 days a week on a master swim team. It became my focus, my therapy, my salvation. And most of all, in the water is where I feel his presence the most. I started competing again. And this past summer, in August, I traveled to Mission Viejo, California, to compete in the U.S. Masters National Championship meet. Ironically, it was being held at the same pool where I swam my first Junior Olympics when I was 5 years old. I wanted to go back and swim in the equivalent of Junior Olympics for old people. I felt compelled to complete that circle, to return and go back to where it all began, my first life, at a time when I'm seeking new beginnings for my next life. This time, I was swimming in Mission Viejo as a 50-year-old, widowed, cancer survivor. I'll tell you a secret about why I compete. It's because when I do, and when I'm in a race, I get to enjoy the hallucinations that grief has to offer. I get to hear Kit's voice as clear as day in my head as he yells at the top of his lungs, cheering me on, as he always did, and as he's doing right now. Thank you. Thank you.